America pumps out over 12 million barrels of oil per day, earning its spot as the largest producer on the planet. So despite being the top producer, America is also the second largest importer of oil. We'll explain exactly why on today's episode of the Infographics Show. The U.S. can't use all its oil. Oil is the world's lifeblood, and the United States is top dog when it comes to production. On average, the U.S. produces around 13 billion barrels of crude oil per day, with some record-breaking days in late 2024 reaching 13.5 million barrels. That adds up to a staggering 4.7 billion barrels per year, enough to fill a Super Bowl-sized stadium nearly every 2 days. Yet America consumes far more than it produces, around 20.4 million barrels of oil per day, or 7.4 billion barrels per year. It might seem ridiculous then that the U.S. doesn't use all of its own oil, but instead exports roughly half of the oil it pumps to other countries. The answer, as usual, traces back to decisions made decades ago, ones that left future generations to deal with the consequences. To understand why, we have to understand the oil life cycle itself first. You can't just take oil from the ground and stick it in your car. Well, technically you can, but it's not going to do much but make your local mechanic very wealthy. Oil needs refining before it becomes anything useful. That means investing in refineries to process raw petroleum into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other essential products. The first step in refining oil is heating it and sending it into a massive distillation column where it naturally separates based on weight. Lighter components like gasoline rise to the top, while heavier fuels like diesel sink to the bottom. This process produces a variety of essential products. Gases like propane and butane are used for heating and cooking, naphtha for gasoline and plastics, kerosene, which is refined into jet fuel, diesel and gas oil for trucks and heavy machinery. The residue at the bottom was once dumped into waterways, but now it's used as ship fuel and road asphalt. The problem is that oil naturally contains heavier products that aren't as useful as gasoline. To fix this, refineries use a process called cracking to break down large molecules into smaller, more valuable ones. Additionally, low-quality gasoline can be reformed by rearranging its molecular structure and boosting octane levels, making it more efficient at powering engines. At some point in the past, people decided that maybe it wasn't a good idea to let oil companies literally smog the entire country with lead and other incredibly harmful chemicals. This meant treating processes were improved and additives like lead were banned. The treating process helped to remove impurities from the fuel that improves the quality of the fuel, but also makes it slightly less catastrophic than it already is for the environment. This process removes sulfur, nitrogen, and heavy metals from oil, making modern gasoline much cleaner than past fuels. Processed fuels are blended to improve performance, stability, or in the case of jet fuel, to ensure it only burns under precise conditions, making it safer for aviation. Oil refining is a complex, costly process, and refineries are incredibly expensive to build, operate, and maintain. And it's not just about money, it's about time. When a refinery is built today, the expectation is it won't start refining fuel for nearly a decade. The problem with American refineries is that most of them are the wrong type. Decades ago, oil companies focused their investments on building refineries along the Gulf Coast, designed specifically to process heavy crude from Venezuela, Canada, and the Middle East. These regions could pump oil all day long, but the real challenge wasn't extraction, it was refining. Globally, the world produces more oil than it can refine, creating a massive backlog in the industry. That oil has to be transported to refineries, which need to occasionally shut down for complicated maintenance. Overall, refining capacity is barely keeping up with oil production, though a major expansion is expected over the next 4 years. Refining is an incredibly complex and expensive process, and historically only wealthy nations could afford the massive investments needed to build and maintain these facilities. With this in mind, American oil companies decided to construct refineries designed for the specific types of crude oil being imported from overseas, rather than refining lighter domestic oil. And this means modern Americans are stuck with the wrong equipment. Oil comes in different types depending on its origin. The U.S. primarily produces sweet crude, but decades ago corporations built infrastructure to refine sour crude instead. Sour crude is the workhorse of oil types. With a sulfur content above 0.5%, it's harder and more expensive to refine into lighter fuels. This low-grade oil is mostly used for heavy machinery and is primarily produced in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Alberta, the Gulf of America, formerly the Gulf of Mexico, and the Middle East. At first, building U.S. refining capacity for this heavy crude made sense. But when domestic oil production surged, the U.S. realized it had a refinery problem. The U.S. does have some sour crude deposits, but it also sits on massive reserves of sweet crude oil. While sour crude is the workhorse of oils, Sweet crude, with its 0.42% or lower sulfur content, is the premium grade. It is high quality, efficient, and high in demand. Refineries prefer sweet crude because it's easier to process and it yields more high-value petroleum products like gasoline, heating oil, and jet fuel. But America is incapable of refining all the superior oil that it produces every year. Instead, it has to export the sweet crude to other countries. And there is still the problem of a crazy 100-year-old law to contend with. But first, why not just modify refineries and make America completely self-sufficient? Well, it's not as simple as just switching infrastructure over, because it would require a massive redesign of refineries. The refineries have to keep running in order to continue feeding the global oil supply and not cause any interruptions. Shutting down these refineries for extensive modifications would have a direct impact on not just the American economy but the world. You can't stop the global oil trade or even slow it down without bad things happening. Economies start to shrink the moment oil availability is affected. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo only lasted 5 months, and despite the US being a major oil producer, it absolutely wrecked the US economy. Inflation skyrocketed from 3.4% at the start of the embargo to 12.3% at the start of 1974. The economic fallout led to unemployment shooting up to 9% in 1975 from 4.6%. The US immediately entered a multi-year recession and the Dow Jones dropped a whopping 45%. This is why the US has made it a priority to ensure the continued free flow of oil worldwide. And while many memes joke about the US invading Iraq for oil, the reality is that America was more concerned with keeping global oil markets stable rather than securing the oil for itself. A disruption in oil supply doesn't just affect one country, it triggers economic crashes, and history has shown that economic instability often leads to war. Shutting down US oil refineries in order to modify them wouldn't be as bad as an outright embargo, but it would slow down the global oil trade enough to be a problem. So for the foreseeable future, we are stuck with a bad bet made decades ago. But why not just build refineries that can handle the right type of oil? Unfortunately, that's not an economically feasible option right now. Building new refineries is extremely expensive, and investors need to be in it for the long haul. For example, the Dangote refinery in Nigeria, which can process 650,000 barrels per day, costs $20 billion to build. Meanwhile, an expansion to Aramco's Motiva factory in Texas required a $30 billion investment. If the upfront cost wasn't already daunting, there's another issue. Investors simply aren't interested. Profit margins in refining aren't high enough to attract non-state investors, making new refineries a hard sell. On top of that, the rise of green energy is further discouraging investment. As electric and hydrogen vehicles become more widespread and renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and tidal power continue to expand, global demand for oil and gas is steadily decreasing. Remember that crazy law we kept bringing up? Well, a 105-year-old law is basically making it impossible for Americans to use their own oil. When World War I broke out, the United States realized it had one glaring strategic weakness. Despite being a maritime nation, the U.S. relied heavily on foreign shipping. In 1920, Senator Wesley Jones introduced the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, aimed at ensuring that America would always have a strong merchant marine fleet ready to call on in case of emergency. More than that, though, it was a way of protecting the U.S. shipping industry from being undercut by foreign shippers, who could pay their crews lower wages and enact lower costs, often by cutting safety corners. What came to be known as the Jones Act required that any ship transporting goods between American ports must be built in the U.S. The U.S. Navy has historically viewed this as a major advantage, as the Jones Act ensures that American shipyards are always employed and the nation's shipbuilding industry remains healthy. The problem is, the Jones Act is sorta making it impossible for America to use its own oil. It's actually cheaper for American refineries on the East Coast to import oil from the other side of the planet than from the Gulf of America. It all comes down to shipping prices. U.S. ships typically cost 4 to 5 times more than their foreign-made counterparts. This is largely due to higher wages for American shipbuilders and strict regulations on ship construction. While a U.S.-made ship is among the toughest in the world, practically unsinkable, that level of durability comes at a steep price. Great for quality, terrible for capitalism. Making matters worse, American merchant marines often earn significantly more than their foreign counterparts. Add in regulations for safety and environmental protection, and the cost of shipping oil between U.S. ports skyrockets, anywhere between 2 to 5 times higher than international shipping rates. And while it can cost up to $6 a barrel to ship Texas oil to an East Coast refinery, importing oil from overseas costs just $2 a barrel. So instead of using its own oil, America ends up shipping a lot of it to foreign refineries. in the most convoluted trade exchange of a major commodity of human history. And then there's an industrial revolution that left American oil refineries in the dust. How can too much be a good thing? Well, when it comes to American oil production, producing too much oil can actually be so problematic that the US can't even use all the oil it pumps. In the 2010s, oil production boomed thanks to a revolution in production. Called the Shale Revolution, new technology and economic pressures led to the development of hydraulic fracking techniques. Normally, oil producers all over the world had been limited to the oil that could be pumped from deep underground reservoirs. However, a lot of oil is actually trapped outside of the reservoirs in what's known as shale rock. These rock deposits lie between 5,000 and 10,000 feet beneath the surface of the earth. While it was easy to get to them, the process of extracting the oil had to wait until the development of horizontal drilling techniques. Here's how it works. A well is drilled vertically until it reaches the shale rock layer, where oil and gas have been trapped for millions of years. Once there, the drill bit turns 90 degrees, running horizontally for about 2 miles to access more of the resource-rich rock. To reinforce the well, steel casings are inserted and cement is poured, a barrier meant to protect local groundwater from what comes next. But the efficacy of that is under serious dispute. To release the oil, a fracking solution is inserted. It's made up of 90% water, around 9.5% sand, and 0.5% chemicals. Its job is to basically fracture the shale rock layer and release the trapped oil and gas. Inserted at pressures of over 15,000 pounds per square inch, the rock layer begins fracturing and the oil and gas flows into the well where it can be extracted. There is significant controversy around fracking, as large amounts of the fracking water will return to the surface due to flowback. What's definitely true is that fracking turned the US into an energy superpower practically overnight. Oil and gas production skyrocketed in the 2010s and completely rewrote US energy policy. But the problem is we weren't ready for the production boom. Oil corporations couldn't predict where American oil production would expand to. Thus, the nation's oil infrastructure is primarily built along predictable production and refining areas. That's a problem when suddenly your biggest oil-producing regions are Texas's Permian Basin, North Dakota's Bakken Formation, and New Mexico, but your largest refineries are in Louisiana, California, and Illinois. The shale revolution triggered a massive boom in oil production, but ironically, it became cheaper to export that oil overseas rather than use it domestically. Getting it to American refineries would have required building extensive new infrastructure, including pipelines, storage tanks, and entirely new rail and shipping routes. Oil is a global commodity, meaning it operates within a global marketplace. The same economic factors that make it cheaper for the US to import oil for refining also make it cheaper for other countries to import American oil, even when closer suppliers are available. Take China, for example. Despite having very few natural oil deposits, it relies heavily on imports to fuel its economy, while remaining a major global refiner of petroleum products. That's because when China crunched the numbers, they realized that global market dynamics made it cheaper to build refineries and import crude from the US rather than buying a finished product from closer suppliers like the Middle East. Despite being geographically closer to major oil-producing nations, China found that importing US crude and refining it domestically was the most cost-effective option, with India following a similar strategy, becoming a major importer of American oil. This has created a convoluted, highly complex web of global oil trade, where some nations import oil from the other side of the planet rather than using their own domestic production. Meanwhile, others import more oil than they need, not for consumption but to refine and sell at a profit. Both India and China have been taking full advantage of cheap Russian oil, refining it into higher-value fuels and petrochemical products to resell on the global market at a premium. Russia, on the other hand, has been stuck exporting raw crude, the least lucrative part of the petroleum chain. Russia has historically relied on Western technology and expertise for refining. But thanks to sanctions and boycotts, they're now forced to sell crude at a discount while other nations reap the real profits. America's unusual oil production, refining, and import system might seem illogical, but it's not changing anytime soon. While this keeps U.S. prices lower than they might otherwise be, there's a strong case for investing in domestic infrastructure now. If the U.S. were to modernize its refining capacity and transport network, gasoline could become much cheaper at the pump, while also making the nation far more secure against global supply disruptions. Should the U.S. invest in fixing its oil infrastructure to lower prices and boost energy security, or is the current system just how the global markets work? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out What If the World Ran Out of Oil Tomorrow, or click on this other video instead.